Okay, so welcome to this next video in the playlist on angiogenesis. In this video, what we're going to talk about is a pathological process called endometriosis. Okay, and the reason endometriosis is being put in my playlist on angiogenesis is that for endometriosis to occur, angiogenesis is an important part of endometriosis, okay, and a future direction for the treatment of endometriosis may well be to inhibit angiogenesis. So angiotherapy may well be a future treatment for endometriosis, which is why I'm going to put it in this playlist on angiogenesis. Okay, so let's start off with what endometriosis is. Then we'll go through a bit of anatomy, so we'll revise the structure of the female genital tract, we'll revise the structure of the endometrium, and then we'll talk about where endometriosis can occur. This will make necessary a bit more anatomy, okay? We'll go through this with lots of pictures. And then we'll talk about the actual theories of how endometriosis occurs, of which there are two main theories, the metastatic theory and the metaplastic theory, but we'll come to that. Let's start with what endometriosis actually is. Endometriosis is basically the presence of endometrial tissue in a place other than the endometrium. Okay, so to make sense of that, I need to tell you about the anatomy of the female genital tract, what the endometrium is, what the structure of the endometrium is, and then where this endometrial tissue can end up, where it should definitely not be, basically. Basically, it's ectopic, which means in the wrong location, endometrial tissue. Right, so let's start off with the structure of the female genital tract then. So we'll start off with the vagina down here. So let's have the vagina here. And then above the vagina, what you then have is the cervix, which is the entrance to the uterus. Okay, so this is the vagina here. Okay, and then a little bulge at the end of the vagina is the cervix, which bulges out with like a sort of moat around it, if you like, and this moat here is called the fornix. Okay, and then let me draw the cervix now. The cervix will have this small little narrow tube that will then enter into the uterus, like so. Okay, so this is the cervix here, and of course it will now open out over here, like so, to form the uterus up here. Okay, and then we'll have the walls of the uterus, like so, and of course the walls of the uterus will have some thickness, so let me draw this as well. So we'll have this as the side of the uterus here, so all of this is the uterus wall, and then we'll try and make it nicely symmetrical, although it already isn't symmetrical, but it's only a picture. Okay, so there's more of the uterus, and then you'll have a infinitesimally thick wall up here. Okay, and then off the sides of the uterus, what will then come is the fallopian tubes. Okay, so you'll have a fallopian tube coming off both of these. So here is a fallopian tube, and I'm not going to draw the fallopian tubes as actually a tube. I'm just going to sort of end this picture. I'm going to basically, here we were actually looking in the side or inside of the uterus, and here is the womb here. So this is the uterus. Okay, and I'm basically just going to draw the fallopian tubes as a tube. I'm not going to show the lumen coming down them. Okay, like so. It will then fold back around to the ovaries. Okay, and it will have a few little fimbria, like so, which will stretch out towards the ovaries. Okay, here. Well, here's one of the ovaries. It will stretch out to one of the ovaries anyway. And the same thing will happen on the other side. So let's just complete the picture now. So here's another fallopian tube curving round like so, and then you'll have the fimbria projecting off towards the other ovary over here. Okay, like so. Right, and here's the second ovary. Right, so now let's label everything up. It's not a brilliantly symmetric picture, but never mind. Okay, so as I'm as I said previously, I'm just drawing the fallopian tube as though we're looking from the outside, which is why I'm not continuing the lumen of the tube inside. Basically, we were looking at the inside of this, but I'm only drawing the outside of the fallopian tube, because effectively it's just a tube going through there. Okay, so here's an ovary here. Okay, these are fimbriae, these projections from the fallopian tube towards the ovary. This is a fallopian tube here. And basically, the endometrium is the name for the surface which faces into the cavity of the uterus here. So the outer surface of the uterus, or maybe you'd like to call it the inner surface, the surface that faces onto the uterus, that's the endometrium. So let me just show a little bit of it here. So this surface here, which I'll highlight now in pink, this is the endometrium here. Okay, and I'm now going to show you the histological structure of the endometrium, okay, because this is what is actually going to develop in ectopic locations, basically. So let's now talk a little bit about the histology of the endometrium. So basically, the endometrium is much thicker than just one epithelial cell thick. It does have an epithelium covering its outermost layer, but it has a huge amount of stroma as well, which is basically connective tissue. And the other thing that makes the endometrium a slightly complicated structure is, of course, that it's not a fixed, constant structure. It changes depending on which point of the menstrual cycle the woman is currently in, basically. So we're going to draw the endometrium at its thickest, basically. We're going to draw the endometrium as it would be by day 14, for instance, of the menstrual cycle. Okay, so let's have a look at this. So basically, beneath the endometrium, the inner layer of the uterus wall is then the myometrium. So underneath the endometrium, you have the myometrium, which is a layer of smooth muscle. Okay, the smooth muscle that contracts during labour. Okay, so the endometrium is then more luminal than the myometrium. Okay, and the outer surface of the endometrium has epithelial cells on it, and basically you have invaginations of the outer surface of epithelial cells into the stroma, as it's called, of the endometrium, like so. And these form what are known as uterine glands, and they're going to be secreting well, a lubricant onto the surface, basically. Okay, right, so here we go. Here are our columnar epithelial cells, like so. Okay, and they will be secreting a sort of mucus onto the surface, which will then, ooze up from this tube onto the surface of the endometrium. Okay, so here are the columnar epithelial cells, which are facing into the lumen of the uterus. Right, so I'll draw them all now, since we're almost done now. So these are columnar epithelial cells. So they're quite tall cells, but it is a single layer of cells. So every single one of the epithelial cells on the endometrium is in contact with a basement membrane underneath, basically. Okay, so you have a monolayer of columnar epithelial cells which are all sitting on a basement membrane, basically. And then underneath this is then called the stroma. So this is the epithelial layer of the endometrium, and I should just stress that all of this is going to be the endometrium. Okay, but you can divide it up into two main bits. You can divide it into the epithelial bit up here, which is made up of this monolayer of columnar epithelial cells, and then this stroma bit, which is all of this, which is mainly made up of connective tissue. Now there's another way of dividing up the endometrium. Okay, and this is based on which portions of the endometrium are lost during menstruation. Okay, so there's a certain portion of the endometrium that is not lost during menstruation, and this is called the basal layer of the endometrium, so this bottom portion here, and I'll put sort of like an imaginary little dashed line to show the distinction between the basal layer and what's known as the functional layer, which is the portion that will be lost during menstruation. So this The higher portion, the portion above the basal layer, is the portion that we're only seeing because we are looking at the endometrium on day 14 of the menstrual cycle, so when the endometrium is at its full height, basically. Okay, and this is the functional layer. So this is the portion that you build during day 1 to day 14 of the menstrual cycle, and then at day 28 you're going to lose this functional layer, okay, during menstruation. Right, okay. And although this is the distinction based on menstruation, which bits are lost and which bits aren't, more helpful distinction, as I said, is the epithelial cell layer and then the stroma, which is all of the stuff underneath the epithelial cell layer. So I'll put that word, so stroma. Okay, and basically within the stroma you'll have a huge amount of connective tissue, but you'll also have the arteries and veins. So let me draw you some arteries and veins. So basically, in the myometrium you have loads of blood vessels known as arcuate arteries. So there isn't just one arcuate artery, there are a huge number of different arcuate arteries. Okay, so any artery that comes off the uterine artery is then called an arcuate artery, and they exist within the myometrium. Okay, so here is an arcuate artery. Okay, and basically these arcuate arteries will then give off branches which will go up into the endometrium. Now the first branch that comes off an arcuate artery that is then sort of moving upwards into the endometrium, this is known as a radical artery. Okay, so let me show this. So here's the radical artery. And then basically the radical artery will then split into two different types of arteries. Some will be straight arteries, which will supply the endometrium. So let's say this is a straight artery. Whoops, it's lost all thickness there. Okay, there's a straight artery that's coming off our radical artery. And then also you'll have these spiral arteries. So let me show you then a spiral artery. So basically, spiral arteries will progress up in spirals, basically, and I think the only way I can show this, well, this is the best I can do, basically. Okay, so it'll spiral up like so. Okay, but that's supposed to mean that, you know, it is actually in a spiral shape. Okay, right, and that will then supply the endometrium. So you have these two major types of arteries here in the endometrium, these straight arteries and these spiral arteries. Now the one final thing to say is that, well, the one final thing to label, I've already said it, is that this invagination of the epithelium into the depths of the endometrium, this is what's known as a uterine gland. Okay, so this is the structure of the endometrium, which is this outer layer of the uterus. It's the layer that actually faces into the cavity of the uterus. Okay, basically, in endometriosis, you are going to get this sort of tissue here, this endometrial tissue, growing in locations other than the outer surface of the uterus. Okay, and that's what endometriosis is. It's ectopic endometrial tissue. So I'll put that fancy bit of nomenclature. So if you want to sum endometriosis up in one, well, in how many words is this? Ectopic endometrial tissue, 3 words, then you'd sum it up as ectopic, meaning in the wrong location, endometrial, meaning pertaining to the endometrium, and then tissue, meaning tissue. Okay, so collection of cells. Okay, right, so let's now talk about the different locations in the body where endometriosis can occur. So where can you get endometriosis occurring? Well, basically, it can occur in the ovaries. The most common location for endometriosis to occur is the ovaries. So we're going to go through loads of different locations where it can occur, and we will do these in decreasing order of incidence, basically. So we'll start with the ones that are most common, okay? And the most common place for endometriosis to occur is the ovaries. Okay, so you often get endometrial tissue growing in the ovaries. That's the most common place that ectopic endometrial tissue will be found. Okay, the second most common place that it can be found is in what are known as the uterine ligaments. Okay, now the uterine ligaments are another name for the round ligaments. Okay, so I'm going to draw another anatomical picture to show you where the round ligaments are. Now, it's a bit difficult to show on this picture that I've drawn here because this picture here is a little bit, well, it's a good picture, but it doesn't really show you the position of these things within the pelvic cavity, basically. So, what I'm now going to show you is a more anatomically accurate picture, so where we're going to actually position things within the pelvic cavity. Okay, so let me tell you what we're actually looking at. Basically, if I've got a little person here, okay, and it's some woman here, okay, basically what we're going to do is we're going to cut through here. We're going to cut her in half, okay, and we're going to do it straight down the middle, okay, so we're going to take a transverse section, and then what we're going to do is look into her bottom half, basically, from above, and I know this is gross, but this is the only way I can describe it. Okay, so we're going to look down, basically, from above, and we're going to look down and see what we will see. Okay, so that's where we are looking from, basically. Okay, so what do you see? Well, basically you find that the uterus is basically positioned flat, well, almost flat, okay? So basically, within the woman, the uterus doesn't usually, it can do, but it doesn't usually go straight up. So it's not usually sitting in a sagittal plane, basically. Usually it's sitting in a transverse plane. Usually the vagina goes up and then the uterus then sits perpendicular to the vagina, basically. So we'll see this picture again later. If we're viewing from the side, basically, so now I'm viewing from this sort of side, you'll have the vagina here, and then the uterus sort of flops back over like that, and I'll draw a better picture of this for you in a moment. Okay, so now when we're looking from above, what we're going to be seeing is the uterus here. Okay, so that's what I'm about to draw for you. Okay, so let's start with the uterus then. So here, this is the uterus, and it will have the fallopian tubes coming off here. And basically the fallopian tubes fold back round, so they're sitting in this transverse plane as well, basically. And they come off in either direction, and they move back towards the back of the body, basically. So this is the front of the body here, this is where the belly button would be, somewhere up here, and then this is the back of the body over here. Okay, so the fallopian tubes will move backwards, like so. Okay, and then we'll have the rest of the uterus sitting here. Okay, like so, and then it will obviously go to the cervix and then into the vagina, and we won't draw more further back than that, okay, and then what we've got is the fallopian tubes circling around, and then obviously they'll have their fimbria projections, which will project towards the ovaries. Okay, so here is an ovary here, and I'll try and make this as symmetrical as possible, but I've already failed that because this is coming up here, never mind. Okay, so here are the fimbria projections, like so, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we've got an ovary here, and I'll try and make it a similar size to the other one. Right, okay, so let's now talk about some important ligaments, basically. So, first thing to say is that there is a huge sort of ligament. It's called a ligament, but it's a very dense piece of connective tissue that sort of spans all the way between the fallopian tubes and the uterus. So basically, the fallopian tubes aren't just these tubes dangling off the side of the uterus. There is this very thick piece of connective tissue that surrounds the fallopian tube and then surrounds the whole uterus and keeps them connected together. It also surrounds the entire ovaries and the fimbria here, and it will continue on down here like so. Okay, so I'll colour this in yellow. So this is a very thick piece of connective tissue that is connecting everything together, okay, and holds the ovary, you know, in position relative to the fallopian tube, so nothing can move. It's all very, very stable, basically. And this is what's known as the broad ligament, and you have it on both sides. Okay, so this is called the broad ligament. Now, at places you have a large thickening of the broad ligament, and, well, it's more than a thickening. You have a extra ligament running inside. So basically, the broad ligament, the way that you can get intuition for it, is if you imagine starting off with your uterus, with your fallopian tube sort of dangling off, and you imagine taking a piece of plastic. So let's take a piece of plastic here, okay? And basically imagine shoving, well, sorry, that's a bad word. Imagine putting the uterus into this piece of plastic and covering the piece of plastic. Imagine cling filming the uterus. That's probably a good analogy. Imagine taking a piece of cling film, wrapping it around the entire uterus, wrapping it around the fallopian tubes, and then basically what you'll have is the two sides of the cling film. You've wrapped it around one side of the fallopian tube, and now the two pieces of cling film will be next to each other, okay, and you're going to stick them together. That's effectively what the broad ligament is. Now basically, in between those two sheets of the broad ligament that are adhering together, you can have other little ligaments moving in between, okay, and that's indeed what you have. You have a ligament that attaches the ovaries to the uterus, and this isn't the round ligament. I'm getting a little bit carried away. I'm just talking about other ligaments whilst I'm got the opportunity. I will talk about the round ligament in a moment. Okay, so you've got this other ligament that runs inside of the broad ligament, basically. Okay, and this ligament is what's known as the ligament of the ovaries, or the ovarian ligament. Okay, so this is the ovarian ligament. Okay, now the uterine ligament is neither of these. So the uterine ligament is not the broad ligament or the ovarian ligament. Instead, it's a ligament that comes off the front of the uterus here, okay? And it will move around over here, so it's moving towards the front of the body, okay? And you'll have one on both sides, like so, and it will then move through the inguinal canal, which is basically just a hole in the front of the abdominal wall, basically. So it moves through a special little hole called the inguinal canal, and it's the same hole through which the vas deferens moves, basically, coming from the testes, bringing sperm up. Okay, so this is the inguinal canal. Okay. Obviously that's in males, not in females, okay, so it doesn't do it, yes, okay, so it won't have the vas deferens moving through it in a female. Okay, so here is again the inguinal canal on this side, and then the round ligament will be now outside of the abdominal wall, and basically it moves round to the front of the body, and it sends its fibers into the labia majora, basically. So, more anatomy. Let's now draw the external female genitalia. Okay, so basically, let's just draw a little picture of this. So, if we draw the external female genitalia, there are these two sort of folds known as the labia majora. Okay, so one's here and another one on this side. So basically, the fibers of the round ligament will contribute to these cutaneous folds, okay, called the labia majora. So here is the left labia majora, and this is the right labia majora. So these are the labia. Well, actually, the singular would be labium, okay? But labia is the plural, so these are the labia majora. So I suppose I should probably have the arrows going to both of them. Okay, then you have another cutaneous fold, which I'll draw like so. Okay, kind of like this. Okay, and these are the labia minora. Okay, so I'm just completing our picture of the female external genitalia. The round ligament has now done what it does. It's contributing to the labia majora. But just to make this anatomically complete, I'll put in the labia minora here. And again, labia is the plural, so I should have this going to both of them. So this is the labia minora. Okay, and the names make sense because the majora are far bigger than the minora. Okay, then at the top here you have the clitoris, okay, and then inside of the labia minora you then have a little chamber known as the vestibule, and it then has two tubes going off. It has the urinary meatus, and then it has the entrance to the vagina here. Okay, so this is the vaginal canal here, or the vaginal orifice. And then the other entrance goes to the urethra, basically. Wait a second, what am I doing here? Vaginal orifice. Okay, and then this one is supposed to represent the urinary meatus. Urinary meatus. And at the top here, this is the clitoris. Right, okay, so that's the external female genitalia. So basically, the round ligaments, or these uterine ligaments, as I should call them, because that's their other name. The round ligaments are also called the ligaments of the uterus, or the round ligament of the uterus, or the uterine ligaments. Okay, they will go through the inguinal canal. They will then be on the external side of the abdominal wall, and they will contribute their fibers into the labia majora. Okay, so you can get endometriosis occurring within these ligaments, okay, and obviously there should not be endometrial tissue within those ligaments. Okay, so I'll just label these now up as the round ligaments. Okay, so that's the second most common place for endometriosis to occur, in the uterine ligaments. Okay, so we will take a break here, and then in the next video we'll talk about the third most common place for it to occur, which is in the rectovaginal septum.